two-part webinar. The first part starts now. It's anti-displacement strategies. And we're going to look at a census tract analysis, have some policy discussion, and then open it up for Q&A. We'll stop promptly at 2 p.m. Eastern to move into part 2 of the webinar, which will cover strategies to attract investment. We'll have a similar format, a census tract analysis, policy discussion, and Q&A. And also, as a reminder, after the webinar, we'll provide both a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides on our webpage, opportunityzonesinfo.org. All of that information and our contact information will be provided at the end. So let's go ahead and get started on part 1, state and local policies to prevent displacement. Everyone here knows that state and local policies can be crafted in a way that allow existing residents and businesses to stay in place, but also to benefit from and participate in the very growth and economic development that occurs in their communities. And this is really of important consideration for neighborhoods that are at risk of gentrification. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with a census tract analysis. I'm going to turn it over to Zac Brown, who is our research director in our Knowledge Impact and Strategy team. Zac?
Thanks, Flora. Let me get my, I said that. So my name is Zac Brown, and I lead, in addition to being the research director for the Knowledge Impact and Strategy team at Enterprise, I also lead much of the Opportunity 360 work that we do. So if you haven't encountered that yet, Opportunity 360 is an approach to understanding and improving outcomes in communities using cross-sector data, engagement, and interactive tools. We just launched our website a few months ago and have some of our initial tools and case studies up there for you to explore and hopefully use, including the Opportunity Zones eligibility tool, which you see a screenshot of in the slide here. We recently updated the tool, by the way, to include all of the designations that have been announced by Treasury to date, so you can feel free to access the tool via the opportunity360.org website or from the Enterprise Opportunity Zone Resources page to take a look at these the new designations and see what some of the characteristics look like. To view just the designated tracts, you can use the drop-down filter on the right side of the screen where you see the red arrow there, and then the designated tracts will show up in orange on the map. So with that said, today I'm going to be taking a few minutes to illustrate the diversity of places that have been nominated or designated as opportunity zones. So we're going to be looking at 3 tracts that have been nominated in Pennsylvania. And in the first part of the webinar, we'll be looking at those tracts through the lens of displacement and displacement risk. And then in the second part, we'll be looking at the same 3 tracts, but through the lens of investment characteristics. And we're going to be looking at them using data that you can pull directly from the Opportunity 360 measurement report that we have conveniently embedded in our Opportunity Zones tool. So you can access that report by mousing over a tract and then clicking the link at the bottom of the pop-up window that comes up where you see the blue text, and that's what that red arrow on the left side of the slide is pointing to. So you can view that information for any of the designated opportunity zones or any of the eligible low-income communities and contiguous tracts in other states that don't have their designations approved yet. So when you click that link, that will open up a 25-page report with all kinds of data about the characteristics of the tract, the relationship to the surrounding region, how it's changed over time, and so forth. So you can find data about the populations that live in the tract to think about displacement pressures. You can look at the housing market conditions there, the prices of housing and rents, and how those have changed over time, and also the kinds of amenities that exist there, such as transit, access to jobs, schools, libraries, and so forth. So if you haven't checked out this resource yet, I encourage you to do so, and I think it's a great kind of resource to start looking at some of the issues we're going to be talking today. We put a lot of effort into developing it, so we hope you'll put it to good use. So with that said, let's take a look at our first example opportunity zone, which you can see here outlined in orange in the middle of the map. This tract is located in West Philadelphia near the Drexel University campus, which you can see highlighted in yellow there on the kind of bottom right of the map. The tract's population was about 94% a racial or ethnic minority as of the last American Community Survey, and had a median household income of $14,000 per year and a poverty rate of 51%. So definitely an economically challenged area. It's actually a federally designated racially and ethnically concentrated area of poverty as well. So from an income perspective, it's certainly a place with residents who are vulnerable to displacement pressures. 72% of the residents are renters, which are obviously going to be typically more vulnerable to displacement than homeowners. And 2 out of every 5 low-income households, that includes both renters and owners, is severely housing cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 50% of their income for housing costs, which leaves very little room in their budget to match future increases in rent. Currently, the housing here is relatively affordable from a regional perspective, though certainly not for the people currently living there. The typical 2-bedroom unit is affordable to a household of 50% of the area median income, and the typical homeowner costs, mortgage and insurance and so forth, are affordable to a household at 80% of the area median income. So obviously that is subject to change if increasing investment functions to increase rents. One bright spot from a displacement perspective, I think, is that 37%, so a little over a third of rental units receive some form of project-based housing subsidy, and 15% of renters benefit from 15% of renters benefit from housing choice vouchers. So despite the significant vulnerabilities in this place, the affordability restrictions associated with the available subsidies could provide an effective buffer against displacement for those who are lucky enough to benefit from the subsidies. And that said, other residents who don't get those subsidies are still at significant risk should there be displacement pressures there. So that's one real-world example. Example number 2 is a tract from downtown Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which, for those who are not familiar with Pennsylvania, is the state capital, and it's a kind of a small city and a center of employment and resources in south central Pennsylvania. This tract sits in the downtown area and also includes the Capital District, so this is right in the middle of the state's power center. The population in this area is a bit different than the last tract. First, because it's much more racially diverse, with about 50% white non-Hispanic residents and 50% people of color. The median household income there is more than double what it was in the previous tract at $30,000, and the poverty rate is lower, although still relatively high at 30%. So still a significant population here that would struggle to match rising housing costs, but not to the same degree as in our first case. Almost 90% of households are renters, so there's an even bigger population that would experience rising rents should that scenario play out here. That said, the housing stock here is also relatively affordable. 85% of rental units are affordable to a household at 50% of area median income. But due to the lower incomes in this tract, there are still 2 out of 5 low-income households who are severely housing cost burdened. So this is still a case where there's not going to be much room in people's budgets to pay for rising rents. We also see in this tract less presence of affordable housing, so only 7% of renters in this place live in units with subsidies, and 10% of renters receive housing choice vouchers. So still some significant displacement concerns that we would want to consider in this zone, perhaps in a different way than in our first tract, given that we're not going to have affordable housing preservation perhaps as an option here. Our third tract is located in Clinton County, Pennsylvania, and encompasses several rural townships and the borough of Renovo in north central Pennsylvania. In this tract, only 4% are people of color, and we have a median household income of $37,000 per year, so the highest of the 3. The poverty rate is still 20%, so it's still a low-income community for the purposes of opportunity zones, but that's significantly lower than either of the previous 2 tracts. The homeownership rate is 75%, so 3 out of 4 people are homeowners, which is a significant buffer against displacement pressures. Those homeowners could potentially see gains from rising property values as well. So, this is a case where rising housing costs may actually benefit more people in the community. For the remaining 25% of households that rent, housing is relatively affordable, with 95% of 2 bedrooms being affordable to a renter at 50% of area median income. So almost all units are affordable at that level. And only 16% of low-income households pay more than half their income for housing costs. We still see a presence of subsidized housing here, with about a quarter of renters receiving project-based assistance, but we don't see the same presence of housing choice vouchers. So in this track, generally, we have a much smaller share of the population that's vulnerable to displacement, and over a quarter of those who are living with some form of housing subsidy. We also see much less burdensome housing costs, with only around 15% of low-income households experiencing severe housing cost burden. So those are our 3 illustrations, which I'll leave there for now. Here are some comparisons across the 3 tracks, just to highlight some of the differences that I just discussed. We don't have time today to really do a full case study on what these places look like and discuss the strategies specific to these tracks, but what I'm really hoping you walk away with from this discussion are kind of 2 things. One is that we can use data to better understand some of the displacement risks and sources of vulnerability that residents are going to face, and we've made that data, as I mentioned, convenient for you to access in our tool without having to know how to track down that information yourself. So you can kind of explore some of these designated opportunity zones in your community and think about displacement pressures pretty easily in the way that I did today. And second, what I'm hoping these examples illustrate is that there's just a huge amount of variation in what these opportunity zones look like and the ways that displacement pressure is likely to occur there, who will be affected, and so forth. Yes, for the most part, they have high poverty rates and lower incomes. That's, according to the legislative design for the opportunity zones tax benefit. But because of the variety that we're able to see, even in this cursory look at these 3 examples, the strategies that might be appropriate for preventing or mitigating displacement pressures might look significantly different in each place. So with that said, I will turn the microphone back over to Flora to talk more about assessing the risks and strategies.
Great, thanks, Zach. I think that's really helpful as communities are asking questions that help them determine what the risk of displacement is in their communities, to be able to use this data to look at what the mix of renters versus homeowners really is, their demographics, education, job skills, and so forth. It's a really important starting point. As we get a little bit deeper into state and local policies that can help mitigate displacement, I wanted to just frame the conversation for a moment and say a couple words about why we're taking the time to talk about state and local policy today. The flurry of federal activity around opportunity zones is definitely winding down. All states have had their opportunity zones designated with the exception of 4 states. So really all that's left now for Treasury to do is issue regulations, which we expect to see this summer, probably in the next month or 2. There's a really big opportunity here for state and local governments to step up and think about how they might be able to steer investments where they're wanted and needed. And this will help, achieve the goals of promoting inclusive and equitable growth, providing existing residents with greater access to opportunity, of course, preventing displacement, and getting money into the right kinds of investments that are geared towards high social benefit. So the first thing that communities will want to think about is assessing their own risk of displacement. All communities are going to land somewhere on the spectrum of risk, and be exposed to varying degrees of risk. But again, start with data. Think about some of what Zach was looking at in the 3 tracks that he looked at in Pennsylvania, and ask the same questions about your community. What is the poverty rate? How close do people live to businesses and jobs? And then, come back to this list we have here is really just a list of anti-displacement policies so that communities can think about conducting their own inventories. And I think it's important when looking at this list, which is not all-inclusive, but it's a pretty good sample of the kinds of policies that help prevent displacement. 2 important questions are, 1, what policies do we already have at the state and local level that might help prevent or minimize displacement of local residents and local businesses? And secondly, does my community have a housing plan? That's a really important question because communities can use an existing housing plan to guide the kinds of affordable housing or community development investments that they want to pursue. And going through this process will help communities to assess their risk, identify some vulnerabilities and pressure points, and then determine what their next steps should be in terms of policies. As you can see from this list, there are a lot of tools when you're thinking through your anti-displacement strategies. You'll have to find whatever is a good fit for your community, but I just want to mention that these strategies are really meant to prevent and mitigate risk of displacement regardless of whether or not you are in an opportunity zone. So if you are in an at-risk community, this is just generally good policy. So I would encourage communities to just think about these issues and their political feasibility given all of the questions that we're hearing around opportunity zones. The next are some anti-displacement strategies. What you see here is actually a lot more specific to the opportunity zone's tax incentive. As I go through these, I encourage folks to keep in mind that the most effective way to protect communities will be to find ways to steer investments towards the projects that you care about. So right now, until we get regulations from Treasury, the answers are not perfectly clear, but we are looking at whether and how states can certify funds that are established in their states. Now, a state would likely be unable to certify a fund that's established in a different state, but this would still go a long way in establishing transparency and understanding the flow of dollars from investors through funds all the way down to communities. We're also looking very closely at how states or local or regional governments could create their own opportunity funds. This would allow government to control at least some of the dollars that might be coming through to their communities and then to implement policies that would steer investments towards projects that are aligned with local community needs. And lastly, I want to say that it's really important right now for communities to start engaging community development, financial institutions, foundations, investors, and any other local intermediaries that are already operating in your communities that can help facilitate the flow of dollars. They're typically well established in the communities that they serve and really understand local needs. Continuing to discuss some strategies specific to opportunity zones, communities can begin to ask themselves questions around the types of state and local policies that can incentivize certain investments in certain kinds of projects. So, for example, can opportunity fund investments be paired with other proven social impact tools? We all know that the low-income housing tax credit and new market tax credits are proven tools for affordable housing and community development. Communities should start thinking about whether or not it's appropriate to steer opportunity fund investments towards community land trusts, or really any other projects that meet some of the needs that you have identified. We're also looking at how governments can build tax incentives that steer dollars towards certain zones or certain projects, and also tax relief that would likewise incentivize dollars in certain zones or projects. I think the theme here is that government officials at the state and local level can think really creatively, looking at the entire tax code, looking at all of their tax credits, and looking at existing economic development and zone-like programs to identify areas where they can layer on incentives that would further drive dollars into the communities and projects where they want to see opportunity funds flowing to. A couple of quick examples that I'll run through. We're having a lot of conversations with state and local governments. Of course, I don't know everything that's happening in all 50 states, but some of these options really stood out to me. In California, Assembly Bill 3030 has been introduced this session. It's not passed yet. It's still pending approval. But this bill would allow affordable housing projects in low-income opportunity zones to proceed without review under the California Environmental Quality Act. It has been amended since it was introduced in the General Assembly, so that investments in opportunity zones don't have, as clear-cut of an exemption, but that it would still incentivize more investments in these areas through reduced regulations. So I wanted to present this here as just a way of getting communities to think about how your state might be able to identify regulations or other barriers that could be eased in order to incentivize investments that have social impact, such as affordable housing or whatever the community's needs are. The second example here is I haven't seen any legislation, but I'm aware that just a small handful of states are looking at their own state's treatment of capital gains tax and how they could provide additional capital gains tax relief on top of what's already being provided by the federal government to drive investments towards certain zones or certain projects. And again, really, creative and interesting way of having a state look at its tax code and its treatment of capital gains to think about how it can further influence investor behavior. And then lastly, Missouri, the Missouri legislature recently passed a bill that modifies the rules around their state historic preservation tax credit. So through that bill, they've set aside some of their historic tax credits for projects that are inside of their opportunity zones. States have lots of different kinds of tax credits. I would, in particular, be interested to see what kind of creative things states can do with their state-funded low-income housing tax credit to pair with opportunity funds that are funding socially minded projects. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hera to talk about the impact of displacement on local businesses. Hera Wright-Smith is our Director for Public Sector Consulting and Enterprise Advisors.
Thank you, Flora. Good afternoon, everyone. As Flora mentioned, I'm Director. I am on the field team with advisors in the advisors group. I manage our socioeconomic development business lines. And today, I'm kind of turning the conversation to small businesses. I think a topic in which there's often very little focus as it relates to this particular issue in general. And so I've highlighted in the PowerPoint key areas in which I'm going to speak on, centered around two critical questions. To frame the discussion, I think the first question is what makes small businesses vulnerable to displacement? And to frame that discussion and to put everything in context, I think it's important to note that we know that a significant share of businesses in the United States are small in nature. In fact, a large portion of businesses are those with less than 500 employees, and an even larger share are businesses with less than 100 employees. But nonetheless, small business activity makes up a significant share of the nation's gross domestic product. So the impact of displacement resulting from gentrification on commercial enterprise is really critical. In terms of local business considerations, there are a few considerations here, I think, that kind of set up businesses to unfortunately place themselves in an unvulnerable position. One of those areas is revenue generation challenges. Often with smaller businesses, and even more specific to micro businesses, there's a struggle with maintaining or sustaining operations, particularly businesses that are what we call in the early stages of business growth. These are businesses that are particularly between the year of 1 and 3 of operation, which in and of itself, from a revenue generating standpoint, can be defined as vulnerable without any external or external impacts on it. The impact of any sudden economic change on businesses of this size can pose detrimental impacts on small businesses. For example, recession, our recent recession, and even natural disasters, as we all may be familiar with, that has happened recently in Ellicott City on their main street. These unfortunate and unexpected consequences place small businesses in a vulnerable position. Economic cycles in and of itself, the ebbs and flows of our economy, place businesses in a vulnerable position. And the resulting consequences is minimally an interruption of any kind in their ability to make money, creates problems, huge impacts, both short-term and long-term. And in many cases for small businesses, these types of interruptions disable or even cripple businesses from reaching even a break-even point in terms of revenue generation. Business loss is often the result. So revenue generation is a challenge here as we think about the vulnerability of small businesses before we even think about the issue of displacement. The second issue is rise in rents and rising land values. Now, this is directly as a result of areas or cities that find themselves in gentrifying conditions. Cities facing growth due to prospering economies, coupled with increased housing prices, also deal with the consequence of business loss in many cases. Vulnerable businesses in conditions such as this have the inability to really compete with larger businesses that may be coming into the area. And as a result, too, rise in land values because of the fact that there's increased housing prices, oftentimes in gentrifying areas, result in increased property taxes, putting added pressures on particularly local or small business operations and their ability to remain in place, which as a result places pressure on these businesses to no longer reside in these particular communities. The third is limited local government policies, which is a policy area when we think about the displacement conversation, really begins to point to policies that I'll speak about in a moment. Historically, local policies have been designed to attract, grow, and protect enterprises, as we may know, centrally located in business districts across the nation. Central business districts have often been the focus, and in many cities across the nation, central business districts, or CBDs, are often located outside of lower income communities. There's an opportunity here with the creation of an opportunity fund to protect small businesses located in what we consider non-traditional places, particularly those that are areas that have small businesses that are clustered or centralized in low-income communities where residents depend on the products and services and goods provided by these businesses. And so this kind of sets the stage around these three particular areas around what makes small businesses vulnerable to displacement. But the subsequent question then becomes, how do we either prevent or minimize displacement? I've highlighted 4 key areas here that I think are interesting policy points for our discussion. Land use is the first. Addressing land use zoning as a means to protect or preserve affordable commercial locations or areas that are heavily established with commercial workspaces is very critical. Strategies that perhaps reinforce planned business districts, strategically located in opportunity zone designated areas, is a critical policy prescriptive for addressing the land use or the rise in rents, and particularly the rise in land values. Planning is the second area. Local governments that participate or have behaviors that are really proactive around their participating in negotiating redevelopment plans designed to prevent displacement of micro and or small business is critical. Negotiating redevelopment plans with developers is really critical here at the early stages of negotiations that can help set up or establish the framework for cities taking a position that protecting small businesses while affordable housing and other types of housing development takes place in gentrifying areas is critical. The third is knowledge. Conducting economic impact assessments is also a very useful measure to understand the value of business services to a city's resident base, and to understand the juxtaposition between the economic value of existing small businesses and the revenues they generate compared to the products and services they sell to consumers, and the consumer purchasing power is really critical to understand the impact and the value of businesses in these communities, and certainly worth the results of these types of studies help kind of provide the support for understanding why it's critical to preserve businesses that are often vulnerable to displacement. Social impact. I think social impact is one of those factors or areas that is often not thought about when we think about economics in general, but there is often social impact. Small businesses are often more than just service providers to consumers. They provide social supports, particularly for low-income communities that are often deplete of resources. For example, small communities that are lower-income communities are often food deserts, where there's areas that have insufficient resources. Small businesses are critical to lower-income residents for these reasons. There are other important implications here in terms of social impact. Small businesses provide local jobs, and so there's a need to have conversations from a policy perspective with respect to workforce development. And the social impact tools that was discussed earlier in our presentation should be coupled with these conversations to make the argument for why preserving or protecting small business is critical. Protecting the local customer base is really important. Small businesses often rely even on buyer and supplier networks that are very local. So the ripple effect of the loss of small business not only affects the business itself, but also the vendors or suppliers that they rely on for their goods and services and products. So this is a very significant issue that has many layers of implications, I think, from a policy perspective, that is worth a conversation. And as we think about opportunity funds and setting up opportunity funds for our designated census tract areas and the policies that go along with that, there's a need to have a conversation about land use, about economic impact, about workforce development, as well as the social factors that align with those. I think the last thing that I will say here before I turn it over to Flora is the issue of advocacy. I think advocacy on the part of business owners is also critical. There's a role for entrepreneurs to play in the larger conversation. Coming together as a group, a coalition or an advisory group that says our main theme is to save our businesses here over time and to sustain ourselves in the context of displacement is really critical. The advocacy voice is important to policy conversation, and business owners with those advocacy voices should be part of the conversation at the table when we talk about policy. So Flora, I'll turn it over to you then.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Okay, at this time, we're going to move into the Q&A. So just as a reminder, please use the Q&A box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen to submit any questions that you have. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I see a couple of interesting questions here. I have one here that says, do you think that there will be regulations that allow state and local communities to create their own opportunity funds, or from the regulations now, can state and local communities do this already? My answer to that is that no, I do not think that any regulations that come out of Treasury will provide any comments on or specific guidelines around whether or not states can do this. However, the current statute on opportunity zones, the way it exists right now, there's nothing in it that would prevent a state or local government from setting up an opportunity fund. And recently, Treasury released a Q&A on certification of opportunity funds, stating that individual taxpayers could simply, quote, self-certify when they submit their taxes at the end of the year. In other words, Treasury is making it as simple as possible for individuals and organizations to establish a fund. So we do think that state and local governments will be able to do this. We haven't seen any set up as of now. I see another question here, also related to the question of self-certification. It says here, funds will be, quote, self-certified, unquote. So how would states be involved in certifying their state funds? That's a really great question. As I just mentioned, Treasury did release some guidance saying that funds would be able to self-certify by just checking a box on a form, which we have not yet seen. It's a really great question because so far no state has figured out how they might certify opportunity funds that are established in their own state. What I would encourage state and local officials to think about is how they regulate the private market and private market dollars in any other way. This is not a federal program. It does not have an appropriation tied to it. It does not flow through a federal agency. So as state and local governments think through policies to influence the way these dollars flow, they should think about how they influence any private capital investment. So how are states certifying other kinds of funds at this point? That would be a really good model for how they might want to approach this. Here's an interesting question. Are there any studies or guides that weigh the relative cost of different anti-displacement initiatives? For example, I've heard that renters are more at risk of displacement than homeowners, but I don't know how much more it costs to support one versus the other. So I'm going to actually put part of the question out to the team, the part around are there any studies or guidance on what it costs, what different kinds of solutions might cost around anti-displacement strategies. I will say that there are anti-displacement strategies for renters and there are separate strategies for homeowners, but there are ways to allow existing residents to stay where they are. There are all, when we think about renters, we often think about tenant protections, eviction protections, affordability, preservation strategies like those. On the homeownership side, it tends to be strategies around property tax relief, foreclosure mitigation, and other activities directly tied to homeownership. So I think it's a really great question. I'm going to open it up to the team here and see what they think about the cost.
Another thing I'd encourage people to think about related to the cost is that we often consider costs of programs that are directed to low-income residents without necessarily aggregating the cost of deferred tax revenue that is accrued to investments that are made in the local community. So that's one thing that we've been thoughtful about as we put together this webinar. But if you're offering tax incentives for investments that are made in your community, that deferred revenue represents a cost to the community as well. So we just want to make sure that we're being equitable in terms of speaking about the cost that we're quantifying and not just isolating that calculation of the cost to those things that represent a budget line item where tax deferrals or deferred revenue could also represent a cost to the community and balancing those two.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. There's a really good question here with regard to the displacement of existing businesses. So I'm going to throw this one to Hera. Hera, the question is, what is the role of microloans in helping to prevent displacement?
Okay, so thank you for that question. Unfortunately, I honestly do not think that the microloans are set up to prevent displacement per se. But there is some direct benefit in small businesses that secure microloans. What it does is secure operations for businesses to kind of bolster their ability to withstand any type of disruption in their business that I described earlier. Microloans provide usually operational support, provide early capital for businesses to get started, working capital, that is, and it provides even resources to secure staff, early staff or administrative expenses that small businesses usually incur in their early stages of operation. So my example and my description earlier about the early stage business at the 1 to 3 year period, a microloan would help kind of secure a business around the early expenses they have to get their operations going. And I think in an indirect way, from that perspective, it does help prevent the interruption, but it also perhaps helps prevent displacement from that perspective in the short term. I'm going to have one of my colleagues, Prayas, who's joining our team today, who has worked with the City of Boston to share perhaps any additional insight he may have to this question.
Yeah, thanks, Hera. So that's a really great question. And as Hera was mentioning, that microloans can be useful to tackle some of the operational challenges that business owners are facing. So just an example, City of Boston actually has a program that provides technical assistance to business owners as the neighborhood is changing and as there's a need for businesses to adapt to the changing neighborhood. And what that does is the consultant can work with the business owner to provide recommendations so that the business can be stronger operationally, and you can use the microloan to implement some of the recommendations that have been provided to you. A second example is also certain programs, I know a lot of cities have this, which relates to the look and feel of the businesses. So whether it is changing your storefront or changing your signage, or even thinking about a marketing plan that is associated with getting a new logo for your business. So you could use the microloan towards that as well. So I think these two programs come to mind when we talk about microloans and how to use that to prevent displacement.
Great, thanks. So I'm seeing a lot of technical questions here, so I might go through and just answer a couple. One question is, are these funds considered federal dollars? The answer to that is no. There is no federal appropriation attached to this tax incentive. There is a cost to the federal government through the loss of tax collections. This is a tax benefit, so money that would have gone to the federal government would now potentially stay with the investor, but no federal dollars. Another question is, what is the timing to release the forms? We don't know. I assume this means the form for self-certification of an opportunity fund. So the answer to that is that we don't know, but that Treasury has said it's forthcoming, and obviously we expect to see it before tax season. Does it have to be through a fund, or could it be via direct investment? So yes, an opportunity fund investment must take place directly through an opportunity fund. It cannot be from an investor directly to the project. It has to go through a self-certified opportunity fund. Having said that, it appears that it would be rather easy for an individual investor to set up an opportunity fund of their own and then invest in projects that way. Here's a question that I'd ask the entire team to kind of jump in on, but it says, have you seen or heard of any private companies or organizations that intend to create funds or promote investments in opportunity zones? I'll start and I'll let others jump in. What I can say is we've heard a lot of interest around this. So we have heard from CDFIs, nonprofit organizations, large banks, healthcare institutions, all of whom have some kind of interest in either setting up a fund or investing their own capital gains into a fund. So there's a lot of interest. We've not actually seen anyone set up a fund. Again, because of the self-certification process, we might not know who has a fund set up until after the 2018 tax season, unless they're out there actively promoting their fund. I will say that Enterprise is very actively looking at what it would take to create a fund and how that would work in the areas that we work in. But as of right now, there's just a lot of interest, but without really detailed regulations coming out of Treasury, I think people are kind of sitting and waiting to get more clarification on how the program might work. There are a couple questions here related to how community organizations or even individuals could get involved to influence any policy that might come out of their state and local governments. I would suggest starting with, a good starting point would be whichever agency in your state was responsible for nominating opportunity zones. In most states, it was either a housing department or an economic development agency, but you could easily go to our website, or the best place to go right now would be the CDFI Fund page to look at all of the designated opportunity zones and determine which agency was responsible for submitting those nominations on behalf of your governor. They will have a really good sense of who was involved and who was participating in the selection of zones. But beyond that, contact your governor's office, your mayor's office. Also, a lot of, I haven't seen any new groups or coalitions being formed around opportunity zones, but most states and regions have different kinds of groups and coalitions that work on affordable housing and fair housing, and those would be groups that would likely be closely involved and definitely deep in the weeds on this topic. Here's a technical question. I'll answer this one. It says, can an opportunity investment be debt or equity or both? I would want to clarify that in the statute, it very clearly states that an opportunity fund investment must be in the form of equity. It's not debt. I don't think we have enough information right now to speak to what the impact of that might be, particularly since investors will exit their investment after a number of years. Okay, so we have more questions, I think, than we can answer here, but the team here will kind of go through to the best of our ability and answer all of the questions that we've received throughout the day using the Q&A box. If you're going to stick around for part 2 of the webinar, feel free to stay on the line. As I mentioned before, folks can drop off or call in as needed. So Donna, if you could go ahead and mute the lines, we'll hold for 5 minutes until we're ready to start part 2.
Sounds good, will do. And with that, let's get started on part 2 with Enterprise's Flora Arabo. Flora?
Okay, thank you, Donna. So this is part 2 of the Opportunity Zones webinar on state and local policies to prevent displacement and track investment. Part 2 is going to focus on strategies for attracting opportunity fund investments. My name is Flora Arabo. I'm the National Director for State and Local Policy here at Enterprise Community Partners. And with me are Zac Patton, Russ Caney, and Victoria Brown. Just a reminder, folks can call in and drop off as they need to. And as Donna mentioned, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you have. We'll do our very best to get to all of them during the webinar and to continue to answer them afterwards. So for those of you who were on part 1 of the webinar, we discussed anti-displacement strategies, particularly for communities that are at risk of displacement of existing businesses and residents. We're going to shift the conversation pretty significantly to look at areas that are really interested in attracting these kinds of investments where displacement is not a risk, but potentially these investments could be really transformative. So we're going to start with a census tract analysis like we did in the first part of the webinar, and then we'll move immediately into the policy discussion, understanding what state and local governments and community-based organizations can do to attract investments to their regions, and we'll move into Q&A. Just a reminder that after the webinar, we will be posting a copy of the slides and a recording. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zac Brown, who is our Research Director in our Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy team.
Hi, everyone. Am I the presenter this time? Yes. Okay. Apologies to those who were on the first part of this, or I wasn't the presenter when I doing this, so the slides didn't advance. So I promised to advance them this time. So my name is Zac Brown. I'm the research director for the Knowledge Impact and Strategy team at Enterprise, and I also lead much of the Opportunity 360 work, which, if you haven't yet seen it, is an approach to understanding and improving outcomes using cross-sector data, engagement, and interactive tools. We just launched our website, and we have some initial tools up there and some case studies for you to explore and hopefully use. One of those is the Opportunity Zones Eligibility tool, which you see a screenshot of in the slide here. We recently updated this tool to include all of the designations that have been announced by Treasury to date, which includes everything except for Florida, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Utah. So all the other states, DC, and territories are included. Although we don't have some of the territories in the tool where there's some of the other data that we're using isn't available. So you can feel free to access the tool via the opportunity360.org website or from the Enterprise Opportunity Zones resource page to take a look at these new designations and what some of their characteristics look like. To view just the designated tracks, you can use the drop-down filter on the right side of the screen where you see the red arrow there that you actually see this time, and they will show up in orange on the map in the tool. So with that said, today I'm going to be looking at a few illustrations that kind of demonstrate the diversity of some of the opportunity zones that have been nominated or designated. So we're going to be looking at 3 tracks. It's the same 3 tracks that we looked at in the first part, but this time we're going to be thinking about them from the perspective of characteristics that matter from the perspective of investment and the workforce that's there and the extent to which they may be able to take advantage of job and economic growth that happens as a result of increased investments through the opportunity zone tax benefit. And as before, we're going to be looking at them using data that you can pull directly from the Opportunity 360 measurement report that we've embedded in our Opportunity Zones tool. So as I mentioned, you can access that tool by mousing over a track and then clicking the link at the bottom of the pop-up window that comes up when you mouse over it. So you can see in the image there's a little box and there's a blue link. That red arrow on the right-hand side is pointing, or on the left-hand side, excuse me, is pointing to it. So that's how you can pull up this report. And the report is about a 25-page report. If you view it online, there's some interactive kind of mouse over text and so forth, but you can also print it out and view it that way. It has all kinds of data about the characteristics of the tract, the relationship to the surrounding region, how that tract has changed over time, and so forth. You can find data about the populations that live in that tract, the housing market conditions, the kinds of amenities that exist there, like transit, access to jobs, and so forth. So we're going to be using that as our kind of base set of information to look at these 3 opportunity zones that have been nominated in Pennsylvania. The first one, there we go. You see outlined in orange there in the middle of the map. This tract, as I said before, is located in West Philadelphia near Drexel University, which you can see highlighted in yellow on the map, and it's less than a mile from other major employers and anchor institutions, such as the University of Pennsylvania. There's also several hospitals and other healthcare facilities in the area. And in fact, because of its location in Philadelphia, there are about 310,000 jobs accessible within a 45-minute commute of this tract. So lots of businesses in the area, lots of job opportunities already existent for folks. It also has good transit access with light rail and bus service, which may be attractive to current or potential businesses, and you can see that indicated on the map there. That kind of green line with the little dots are light rail stops. There's also bus service. The neighborhood has a relatively high residential vacancy rate of 25%, as well as many vacant lots as well. So there's certainly land available for development or redevelopment activities. It's also a designated qualified census tract. It's a high housing needs tract. It's CRA eligible. All of those things making it potentially more attractive for housing and other investments that can utilize the federal programs that target tracts with those designations or provide some kind of incentive for activities in those tracts. One infrastructure challenge that we see is that portions of the track lack wired broadband access, which may be a barrier for many businesses who require higher speed internet access. Another thing that we want to think about from the perspective of the investments is whether the local workforce is likely to be able to take advantage of new jobs and other economic growth that will hopefully occur as a result of opportunity zone investments. So the workforce in this tract is challenged. There's a 26% unemployment rate as of the last American Community Survey. 73% of adults have a high school diploma, so more than 1 in 4, or 1 in 5 rather. Well, actually, yeah, more than 1 in 4 lack a high school diploma, and only 6% have a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. So this is definitely a population that's going to struggle with job creation that focuses on positions that have higher education requirements. Our second tract is from downtown Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which for those who are not familiar with Pennsylvania is the state capital and a small city and center of employment and resources in south central Pennsylvania. This tract sits in the downtown area and includes the Capital District. So you can probably imagine already that the investment profile is going to look quite a bit different in this tract than in the last one. Anchor institutions in and around the tract include, major anchor institutions, I should say, include the State Capitol Complex, Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, and the UPMC Pinnacle Harrisburg, as well as the State Museum of Pennsylvania. So those are all major institutions in and around the tract. It's a relatively walkable area, but lacks the level of transit access that we saw in the first tract. Because of its location in a smaller city, there are fewer than half the number of jobs accessible nearby compared to Philadelphia. Not surprising, given that's a smaller city. But there's still good job access here with around 112,000 jobs accessible within a 45-minute commute. So still lots of businesses in and around the tract that could be potential beneficiaries of investments through the Opportunity Zones program. Has a relatively high residential vacancy rate of 19%, meaning there may be opportunities for development, redevelopment, using investments not quite as high as the previous tract. Like the first tract, it's a qualified census tract, a CRA eligible tract, a high housing needs tract. However, this tract is also a USDA low grocery access tract, so potentially food access related activities that may be kind of eligible for participation in federal programs that use that designation, or other state and local programs that use that designation. So that's a potential plus. On the workforce, we have a more reasonable unemployment rate of 9% compared to the first tract, with 82% of the local workforce holding a high school diploma and 31% holding a bachelor's degree or higher. So that's certainly a much more educated workforce in the tract, and therefore potentially better able to take advantage of new jobs and economic growth that may occur there. Though we should point out that there's still a significant portion of the workforce that may be challenged to do so. And lastly, we have our third tract, which is located in Clinton County and encompasses several rural townships in the borough of Renovo in north central Pennsylvania. So this is a place without the same kinds of major anchor institutions that we saw in the other two tracts. So certainly local businesses likely anchor the communities that are in the area. The residential vacancy rate here is very high, with nearly 3 out of every 5 units vacant. So certainly a huge opportunity for redevelopment of those homes. So given that this is a rural tract, I would guess that land availability is probably not going to be as much of a constraint as in the other two tracts that are in more urban areas. So that may not be as much of a benefit as it seems from an investment perspective. We also don't see access to jobs or transit access in the way that we saw in the other two tracts. There are less than 600 jobs accessible within a 45-minute commute, which means fewer existing businesses in the area that might be eligible for investment to utilize the tax benefit. And there are also areas of the tract that lack broadband access, which, as I said in the first example, is a potential barrier for businesses that might require higher speed internet access. The tract is CRA eligible, but is not currently a qualified census tract or a high housing needs tract. And so there may be less incentive for housing developers who want to use federal programs that rely on those designations. And on the workforce side of things, the tract has about a 9% unemployment rate, so similar to the second tract we looked at, and reasonably low, and still a little bit higher than the national average, I think. But on the other hand, the rates of higher educational attainment, especially of residents in this tract, are not as high. So 85% of residents have a high school diploma, but only 1 in 10 has a college or graduate degree. And I should also point out that given that this is a rural tract, the workforce characteristics here are, I think, all the more important since there are fewer workers in a reasonable commuting distance who might fill local jobs that are created as a result of investments. So the workforce within the tract is more likely to be kind of in play for any kind of workforce-related decision. So as before, here are some comparisons across the 3 tracts to highlight some of the differences we see, this time from the investment and workforce perspective. As in part 1, we don't have the time to do full case studies on these, but I'm hoping that really what you walk away from this with is 2 things. First, the sense that we can use data to better understand these places and some of the characteristics that are relevant to consider from an investment and workforce perspective, and that we've made some of that data available to you conveniently through the Opportunity Zones eligibility tool without you having to track down that information yourself. And secondly, what I'm hoping these examples illustrate, as in the first case, is that there is a huge amount of variation in what opportunity zones look like, how attractive these places might be for potential, for different types of investments, and whether and how the local workforce in the opportunity zones might benefit from the job and economic growth in the zone. So because of that variety that we're able to see, even in this very cursory look at these examples, I think the strategies that might be appropriate for attracting new business, for making the case to investors, for connecting the local workforce to those development activities are going to look a little bit different. So with that said, I will turn the microphone back over to Flora to talk more about some of the challenges and strategies associated with investments and attracting them.
All right, great. Thank you, Zac. So before we discuss some of the details around what can be done, what kind of policies can be implemented, and activities that can be undertaken to attract investment, I want to frame the conversation just a little bit so that folks understand why this is such an important consideration, especially for those zones that want to attract investment. The first thing is that this is a market-based approach to community development. When all is said and done, there will be more than 8,000 opportunity zones across the country. And of those 8,000 opportunity zones, none are guaranteed to receive investment. So this is going to create competition among zones, among states. And investors will be asking themselves, why should I put my money in your community instead of the community next door? So lots of competition. Secondly, it's critical to understand investor behavior. I think that local governments should be asking themselves, how can we incent investment in our identified priorities or projects, especially if they're ones that may have a higher perceived risk and a lower return, but would be beneficial for the community. So, for example, can state and local governments put assurances in place? Perhaps they can commit that any investments in infrastructure that will make a place more attractive to investors, like broadband, roads, sidewalks, beautifications. Perhaps state and local governments can subsidize investor returns, provide additional tax deferrals, think about things like exemptions on state liability for certain types of investments. And generally, it's just going to be really important to consider how else governments can de-risk capital and influence investor decisions so that communities can steer opportunity funds towards the projects and the areas where they want to see those dollars go. I do think there's also, the potential for not only the state and local governments, but also local philanthropy to see whether or not they can help seed some funds or take a first loss position or reduced rate of return on those funds in order to help de-risk the capital that would reduce risk for investors. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Russ Caney. Russ is our Director of Programs in our Rural and Native American Initiatives. Russ, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Flora. So I have the opportunity with Enterprise to do a lot of traveling, and we work in rural communities. I am based in the Midwest, upper Midwest. And so when this program came out and we started looking at some of the opportunities, obviously, as everyone has been paying attention, the opportunity zones being named was really the first step, and really wanting to see state by state what's included in an opportunity zone. We work with a lot of housing professionals. We work with a lot of economic development groups that are doing community development, but just trying to bring jobs and opportunities to rural communities coast to coast. And so I think some very basic questions for a lot of folks that I'm talking to about opportunity zones is, first of all, just understanding what it is. And it is new. And really, am I in an opportunity zone? I mean, we started to see most of them being named now. So it's really a matter of, am I in an area, or is my organization working in an area, whether it be in a community or many times on a county-wide basis, or in rural areas, maybe even on a regional basis, where are these opportunity zones located? And if you're not in an opportunity zone, really how close are you to an opportunity zone? If you're thinking about jobs and you're thinking about an investment coming to your area, you're probably going to be thinking regionally, because as many of us know, dealing with the rural communities, you're dealing with people that are willing to commute, drive distances for jobs and for other services. It's kind of a way of life where you choose to live may be different than where you happen to work. So you may be able to benefit your community or your region by being close to an opportunity zone. So knowing that would also be helpful. Understanding what the investor motives are, this was alluded to earlier in a slide by Flora, but understanding whether the investor that may be coming to you and talking about your zone or a nearby zone is interested in the permanent exclusion or the step up in basis or the temporary deferral aspects of their investment. And then looking at what would be a potential investor scenario, not only for presenting that to an investor in any of these three categories of an investor motive, but also being able to discuss with your current business owners and businesses in your particular region what an investor might be looking for, and then provide just some scenarios as to how this might work and play out. We don't have all the answers for this, obviously, with the regulations and some of the guidelines that are still to come, but I think it'll be important to figure this out and be able to have something to present. So we go to the next slide. So just beginning some engagement process, I think it's going to be important just to raise the awareness of opportunity zones with your own local networks. And you can't assume that everyone follows the tax code and is following what's happening in the regulatory area on opportunity zones. So make sure that you're at least discussing it with people, banks, developers, property owners, business networks that you may have locally, regionally, within your county area. And just to raise awareness of what the opportunity might be to local businesses and some of the companies that are in your area. Also, developing relationships with any types of trade schools or universities or two-year colleges or business incubators or anyone else that's involved with the workforce. Just thinking about some longer-term strategies. We've been seeing now in many states where labor is becoming an issue because of low unemployment rates, not in every area, but many areas, including rural areas, there is a labor crunch. And so if you're looking at someone coming in and starting to explore your area for an investment versus another, they very well may be looking at some of the numbers that you have as far as unemployment, where's the workforce coming from. If I come in and invest in your area and we need an increased workforce, where is that going to come from? And if we do need to recruit a workforce for this particular investment, are we going to be able to house those folks? Do you have adequate housing, or is there a lack of housing that can pertain to this particular area? And then really tapping into the network of people that are looking kind of down the road, over the horizon a bit. These would be some of the local planners, county planners, regional planners, and developers that are looking at ongoing work, what's in their pipelines, what do they see coming down the road, and just having that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about talking to investors. The next slide, please. So one opportunity that you have, waiting for some guidelines and some other clarifications on opportunity zones is, and many organizations have already done this, is inventory your local assets and what you have available to you. What you have as far as land, shovel-ready sites, so what your infrastructure situation happens to be, buildings that are available and can potentially be placed into service, housing, commercial buildings and such, and just generally what that looks like. And being able to present that in a way that you quickly can grab an investor's attention. Wherever you are going to find investors, you may have a very short window or a small window to make your pitch as far as your area. And I just put on here an elevator speech, which is basically a 5-minute, very short presentation on what would be attractive to an investor to come to your area. Obviously, written materials, websites, and social media are going to play a big part in attracting and just getting the attention of investors that really can come from anywhere. And then we've seen this already in some areas in the Midwest where before opportunity zones came into play last December, we were seeing just some local businesses and local organizations getting together and trying to attract investors on their own, banks on their own, and just having an investor day. Being able to get people in one place and being able to have presentations about investment needs and some scenarios that they'd be able to look at. And this would be, I think, very helpful, not only for the local community regionally, but also helpful for investors to just get a sense of what is out there and to talk to some actual people on the ground. The next slide, please. So it's been discussed before, but there are, with over 8,000 opportunity zones across the country, there is going to be competition. There is going to be incentives that are likely going to come into play, both at the local level, the regional level, and with statewide partners. And these are things that you can start discussing now and start promoting some add-on incentives that may help in your particular area. And be vocal about what works and what you think would be attractive to an investor. And then just keep your eyes open as far as what other opportunity zones, either in your state or other states, are offering potentially for investors. You always have some local items that you can look at. Reduced abated taxes, waiver of fees, tax incremental financing comes into play in many states. Workforce development training will, I think, become even more important as the economy has picked up and we're starting to see some squeezes on labor for many types of industries and businesses across the country. And then really to stay informed and stay connected with your peers, both regionally and within your state, and to think long-term about the benefits. They may not be immediate to you in talking about and learning about and attracting to investors, but they certainly can be to your advantage having the knowledge about opportunity zones and an investor climate and thinking long-term. You always have locally the ease of doing business, promoting the ease of doing business. You should know your numbers on workforce and potential training opportunities for additional workforce in your area. You should know your infrastructure and what you have, and be honest as to what you don't have and what you're promoting as far as bringing in infrastructure, and mainly thinking about broadband and just some transportation issues and such. And then really just being open about the process. And I think investors, as they come along and will be interested in a particular zone, they're going to be comparing zones. They're going to be very savvy. So if you have the answers about your area and know your numbers, it'll go a long way to attracting that investment to your area. Flora?
Great. Thank you so much, Russ. We're going to move into Q&A shortly, but I just wanted to cover a few examples. Those of you who were on the first part of the webinar will note that we did already cover these examples. I'm now going to look at the examples from a lens of attracting investment instead of a lens of preventing displacement. So I mentioned earlier that in California, Assembly Bill 3030 had been introduced, and essentially what this bill would do if passed is provide some regulatory exemptions around the California Environmental Quality Act for investments in opportunity zones. We did get a lot of questions on this during the first webinar, and I just want to say that we don't necessarily endorse this piece of legislation, but we did identify it as a strategy where states are looking at regulatory barriers and thinking about how they might ease some of those barriers in order to attract more investment. So it is one kind of strategy that states can think about. Are there regulatory barriers in your state or your region that can be eased to attract more investment in specific kinds of projects in your zone? Secondly, I don't have any examples of existing legislation. I haven't seen anything proposed, but I'm aware that there is a small handful of states that are currently weighing options for how they might provide preferential treatment of state capital gains in opportunity zones locally. So I do think that states can think about, and local governments, not only their treatment of state capital gains, but also their entire tax code, any tax incentives, and think about how those can be used to incentivize and attract investment. And then lastly, Missouri recently passed Senate Bill 590, which modifies their state historic preservation tax credit. And essentially what that does is provide a greater tax credit for investments in opportunity zones. So again, it's worthwhile to look at the state tax credits. I'm really interested to see how creative states can get with a state-funded low-income housing tax credit, and potentially use that to pair with the opportunity fund investments to attract dollars into opportunity zones that would like to see some of those investments. And then just real quickly, since we are wrapping up, I want to say a word or two about what's next. You know, part of the reason why we're hosting this webinar is because we want people to get involved, engage your governors, your mayors, your economic development agencies, community-based organizations, and of course residents to assess their needs. Stay informed. As soon as we hear anything out of Treasury around regulations or any other developments, we would of course be sharing those. And please reach out to us and let us know what kind of new and innovative ideas that you're hearing on the ground. This is how we're able to collect those best practices and share and disseminate them. So we're going to move with that to Q&A. We're getting a lot of questions through the chat box, so please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. of your screen to submit your questions. We'll do our best to get through them. And Russ, if you're still on the line, I actually have a question for you that came through the Q&A box. It says, Russ talked about temporary deferral, step-up in basis, and permanent exclusion. Can you explain what these terms mean or give some examples? And Russ, if you're still on, we'll need you to unmute your line or ask Donna to unmute it for you.
No, I am on, and that's a great question, and I'm not going to be in a position to be able to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know that the three categories are out there, and they all have some time limits to them, and it's going to be different pieces. But there is some information out there in multiple sites about the difference between the three. But I think that's part of what you need to understand as an economic developer, as an economic person that is going to have to be able to explain that more probably to your community and business community rather to the investor, because they're going to know what they're probably looking for and after. But I think it's going to be important for you as kind of this conduit to figure out where the investor is coming from. Are they looking more long-term, or are they looking more on a temporary basis for the tax advantages?
Okay, thanks, Russ.
This is Victoria. I just wanted to offer up a couple more questions that we got through the Q&A box in the webinar format. And so this one, I believe, is for Zac. It's come up a few times. Folks are wondering if it's possible to pull down multiple communities at the same time through Opportunity 360, and I was wondering if you could just speak to the existing functionality and any functionality that may be coming in the future.
Yeah, that's not something that you can currently do on there. It is something that we're working on. So both the ability to pull, to kind of select multiple tracks and pull reports for each, but also the ability to select multiple tracks and pull a report for the combined, for the information across the combined tracks. Like if you had a service area or you had a site that spanned two tracks or something like that, and you wanted to do that. So those will be functions that we will be releasing later down the road. Unfortunately, that doesn't provide a solution for you now, but that's the pace of development.
Thanks, Zac. This question, I think, is for Russ as well. One of our participants asked, are there key strategies that small communities or rural areas should employ in identification of potential investors?
Yeah, I think from the smaller community standpoint, depending on what you have in place now from a standpoint of a business development office or an economic development, I see a lot of smaller communities that even though they don't see maybe immediate benefits or see something that they're is coming to them immediately, are joining either countywide or regional associations of economic development type groups, just to associate themselves with a bigger body, and then have the opportunity. I think all of the things that I talked about are still the same as far as inventorying your assets and knowing your numbers and knowing your demographics, using Opportunity 360 to help you with that, but really belonging to kind of a bigger, wider network of your peers to be able to make your pitch both through them, but then also being very up on your own numbers in your community.
Thanks, Russ. I think there's a couple technical questions that I'll direct to Flora. The first one is, do you know of any proposed restrictions with the Opportunity Zone Fund transactions with the use of tax-exempt bonds?
So, you know, there's quite a few questions here in the Q&A box that ask about restrictions around pairing opportunity funds with a wide variety of existing tools, whether it be private activity bonds or low-income housing tax credit, and a whole slew of other existing tools. My read of the legislation is that there's nothing in statute statute that would prohibit the pairing of opportunity funds with those kinds of existing tools. However, because we don't have detailed regulations out of Treasury yet, it's very hard to understand how exactly that's going to work, how deals are going to be underwritten and closed, because these are not debt investments, these are equity investments through which the investor will exit after a number of years. So we still, I think, have to see how. I do think they'll be able to be paired, and, the question is, if so, how.
Another similar question that came through is, are there likely to be federal incentives associated with opportunity zones, or just those created at the state and local levels?
I think it's very unlikely we'll see much of anything coming out at the federal level. So, no, I don't think we'll see federal incentives being paired with opportunity zones. I think that the regulations that come out this summer will probably be on the thin side, meaning it will not be a heavy-handed regulation. And so it's really now at the play is at the state and local governments. We heard as much from Congress a couple of weeks ago. Another question I saw pop up a couple of times here, I'll just read this one because it kind of encapsulates it pretty well. It says, are there guardrails in place to prevent investments that do not coincide with local needs? The answer is essentially no. There is a provision in the statute that would prohibit so-called sin businesses. So, for example, you couldn't use opportunity funds to invest in a new golf course. However, beyond that, there's nothing in the statute that says that these investments have to meet or address local needs, that they have to go towards much needed or socially minded projects, and those guardrails will likely have to be put in place at the state and local level, but when Treasury issues the regulations this summer, we'll have to wait and see whether or not they've placed any additional protections in place. When we testified in front of Congress, we did urge them to further define abuse and other activities that would be harmful to low-income communities.
Thanks, Flora. Another question that has come through is whether we could speak to using opportunity fund investment on tribal land.
There have been some opportunity zones that have been designated on reservations and trust land, and I can't name them offhand. I know just looking at the numbers that came from Wisconsin, there were a couple of reservations that had some opportunity zones designated. I haven't looked at all the western states where you have large land areas that are typically tribal. But yes, there are some, and so that's going to be an opportunity.
Yeah, I took a look at the intersection of the opportunity zones and tribal tracts earlier today, actually, and it looked like a little over 2% of all tracts had some kind of 2% of all opportunity zones had some kind of intersection with tribal tracts. So, not a ton, but not just a few here and there.
Thanks, Zac and Russ. Flora, I think you highlighted a lot of really great ways for communities to be considering their state and local policy and how those intersect with opportunity zones. One participant asked what the best way for community members and institutions to weigh in on the opportunity zones process and requirements would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, all of the states have nominated their opportunity zones, so that process is complete, and all states except for 4 have had their opportunity zones designated. So the whole process of determining who gets to be in an opportunity zone has kind of come to a close. Now it's kind of a wait and see period right now, where we're waiting to get detailed regulations from Treasury so that funds can be set up and investors can start sort of opening up their wallets. So I think right now the best thing that communities can do is engage their local governments, but also, to the extent possible, engage state governments At the state level, I think that the place to start is with the Economic Development Agency or the Housing Agency, whomever was designated as the point person by the governor for the zone nomination. In most states, it's your state Economic Development Agency, and we have seen that the Economic Development Agencies that were involved in the process of nominating and submitting zones have just kind of become de facto sources of information for communities in their states. So they're now starting to do things like organize meetings and webinars. So that's a really great place to start. And locally, I think that a really good starting point would be organizations and coalitions who are leading the charge on issues related to affordable housing and fair housing.
I've seen several questions on here about when we expect guidance from Treasury.
Yeah. We're expecting guidance roughly around June or July, so in the next month or two. I guess they, technically could take a little bit longer, but they're definitely, I don't think that's likely. Congress is very eager to see this program move forward, and so it should be very soon. And as soon as we have that information, it'll be up on our website, which is opportunityzonesinfo.org.
This is potentially for all the panelists, but are there other ways to leverage Opportunity Zone funding that help to build community wealth, such as cooperative ownership models, affordable home ownership, or commercial linkages to support small business growth and development?
Mm-hmm. I think that shared equity, co-op models, all of those things have strong potential. So I apologize for giving the same answer where I say, well, it depends on what comes out of, Treasury's regulations. We just can't say for sure, but I do feel strongly that those are going to be potentials. For example, there's a lot of reason to think that opportunity funds could be used to purchase a community land trust. So those kinds of models, I definitely think have a lot of potential through this tax incentive.
Yeah, I'll just add that, in a lot of rural communities you have, something that is a kind of a starter project, something that will kick off a lot of other investment. We've seen just kind of a stagnation of things not happening because of the recession and then the lingering effects of it. So I think something that would come into play would be that investment that gets a business, an area downtown, the retail area, a lot of different things. Just be thinking about what could really kick off additional investment. Not only because of the opportunity zone, but just from attracting people and resources and attention to what you're doing.
We've had a few questions that have asked some variation of whether there's an opportunity to change the opportunity zones, or there's one here about whether with the 2020 census or some kind of there's new poverty rates that make attract ineligible, will that no longer qualify as an opportunity zone? Mm-hmm. In the absence of some kind of legislative change, the answer is no, those will continue to be opportunity zones, and no, there's no ability to add new zones once they've been certified. So
right. Once your zones have been designated, they're locked in for 10 years. So that's why there was, a lot of flurry of activity trying to get the word out that folks should engage their states, trying to better understand what the implications of that would be. The only possibility, unless there's a statutory fix, the only possibility of that changing is if Treasury were to issue regulations allowing that to happen, but we don't have any indication from Treasury that they're going to do that. So for the most part, the zones you have today are the zones you're going to have for the next 10 years. I have another technical question here. It says, are opportunity funds state, regional, or project specific? Who will administer the opportunity funds, HUD, Treasury, or some combination? actually opportunity funds are not specific to any territory or geography, and they will not be administered by any federal entity. So, in other words, so opportunity funds can be managed by any fund manager. So, for example, we at Enterprise, we have a loan fund division. We're a fund manager. We could potentially run an opportunity fund. And a high net worth individual, somebody who's just really rich and made a lot of money on the sale of some property, could take their money. My read of the statute anyway is that they could create an LLC, call it, the Flora Arabo Opportunity Fund, and put their money in and start investing. So there's a lot of different ways it could happen. I think it's important to know that who you are or where the money comes from or where the fund is established in no way influences where the money goes. So I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm not a high net worth individual, but if I were and I started an opportunity fund, I could put all of my money in Wyoming. I could put it in one zone in California. I could share the money across all the zones in the United States. There are absolutely no geographical restrictions on where the money comes from or flows to.
But that said, funds could set themselves up to have a geographic focus if
yes,
they wanted, right?
That's right. I mean, as long as the money goes into an opportunity zone, that's really the only restriction. Yeah. But if a state or a local government were to set up their own fund, they could certainly attract investments, to the, let's say, State of Virginia Opportunity Fund, for example, and therefore whatever investments they can attract, they could ensure stay in the state in which they were, established in.
We've gotten a few more questions about community engagement in this process, and I think that it would be helpful to clarify for one question that came in particular, asking about whether or not there was a requirement for local community engagement. We just wanted to make sure it's clear that there is no federal requirement for community engagement, and that's definitely one of the reasons we want to make sure that all of you who participated in today's call continue to stay engaged and educated on the rollout of opportunity zones so that you can find pathways to make your voice heard among your local stakeholders so that your communities receive the greatest benefit from these funds.
There's a question here about whether or not opportunity funds could go to developments where the developer is a non-for-profit. We do think that opportunity funds will likely be able to be used in affordable housing development deals. It's worth, regardless of whether or not the developer is a non-for-profit or for-profit. It is worth noting, though, that it's probably likely that opportunity funds will not be able to be used for acquisition rehab projects and will probably be used for new construction as it pertains to affordable housing, just because of the step up in basis and the return to investors that are going to be needed to make the program work. All right. There's a lot of really great questions here. We have about almost 200 questions in our inbox, so we're not going to get through all of them today. But what I will do is put up our contact information as well as our website. The best place to go for information is opportunityzonesinfo.org. That's where we're going to post our recording of this webinar as well as the slides that we're using here today. You also have the email addresses of the entire internal team here, so we can do our best to answer your questions. Any other questions you guys identified coming through, or is that it?
There's a few technical questions that we just don't know the answers to yet, in the absence of the regulation.
Yeah. We're going through everyone's questions as you're submitting them, and it's definitely worth pointing out that there's some really great questions, a lot of really great questions here about, B corporations and, you know, technicalities around how to apply and so forth. These are primarily questions, if we didn't mention them verbally today, it's because, most likely it's because we don't have any answers. But please stay in touch, keep tabs on our website. We'll do our best to provide the latest information as it comes out. And otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. And feel free to continue submitting your questions. And thank you all for joining us.
And at that point, I would like to also mention that when we close down today, you will be automatically taken to a very, very brief evaluation survey. We would love to get your feedback. It really means a lot to us to hear your input on our webinars. So if you have just a minute or two, that would be greatly appreciated. And with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today, and especially to you, our participants. We greatly appreciate having you with us, and we hope to see you online again very soon. With that, this ends today's webinar. Goodbye.